All right, I'm going to call the Capital Improvement and Planning Committee meeting to order for Monday, November 27th. It's 7:02 p.m. and we have 4 out of our 5 members present, which constitutes a quorum. First order of business tonight. That's actually, I'm going to see if this is Steve. Steve, if you're the guest in the attendees, can you just raise your hand? Steve Holland, that is. All right, let it be for now. All right, first order of business is the approval of meeting minutes from October 16th of 2023. These were drafted and circulated by Joe. Are there any questions or comments on those? I had one, Joe, at some point you were trying to say CIPC, but I think a letter got inserted. We became CIAPC or something like that. It was at the bottom. I looked at that a while ago and I forgot to mention it too. I can find it. It's under item 6. Second paragraph. It says CIAPC.
Got it.
As much as I want to be part of the CIA, All right. Are there any other comments or questions on that? All right. I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes with the minor typographical edit. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All right. Roll call vote. Jeff?
Aye.
Tony?
Aye.
Joe?
Aye.
And I am as aye as well. So it's a 4-0 vote. Chair and member updates. Neary Building Committee continues to meet on a pretty regular cadence at this point. The major item that we discussed last time that continues to be the topic of discussion is designer selection. Mark, I believe Mark's on that subcommittee, so I'm not. So I believe you have another meeting tomorrow night on that. Is that correct?
Wednesday night.
Right. Today's Monday. So yes. So
I'd like to rush the week along too, Jason.
I'm trying. I think the intent at that meeting is for at least the town committee to form a view on the one of 4 vendors that they would prefer. But remember, the MSBA has a vote, and that meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday. So the goal is after next Tuesday, after an MSBA / Southborough vote, where MSBA holds the majority, that we would have a designer to negotiate a contract with. So the goal would be to then get the contract negotiated before the holidays so that we would start our cycle in January of actually doing some work. To date, it's taken 6 months to procure essentially 2 vendors, an OPM and a designer. So that's where that project is at. We continue to say sometime in spring of 2025, there would be some sort of town meeting action requested. I don't think the intent that it would be part of the annual in March, but that would be ultimately open to the select board and based on the timing of that committee's work. Any questions on Neary Building Committee? Community Center Exploration Committee is close, but not final to wrapping up their work. There will be a presentation to the select board in January as of now, subject to actually getting that calendared. It will provide a bunch of options of how, in particular, Finn could be reused. And it would also show some illustrative examples of how any one of the groups, whether it be the senior center, the library, or recreation doing their own thing, what the cost would be of that sort of project. As you can imagine, they're not small in any way, shape, or form. But if you think back to the work that a lot of you were involved with, a year and a half ago, there's just a lot more consensus around the potential around Finn than there was with Woodward. So that's, there's a final presentation that still needs to be voted on by that committee, the individual members that are representatives of the library board, the council on aging, in the recreation commission. We're supposed to go back to their boards for feedback as well to try to get some consensus around the path forward. So that data would be sitting there for the school committee to make educated decisions on whether we consolidate educational facilities as the NERI process continues. Questions, comments? All right. With that being said, we will be kicking off kind of hearing from, it's not all department heads, obviously, but it's department heads with major capital needs that are not self-explanatory, in allowing them to kind of answer questions on what they submitted for this year, and for us to really discuss the viability tonight of some of these proposals. That's the key thing, is this is about viability, need, is this the right time? We'll have to work through, especially with Brian, funding sources as we proceed. And obviously we haven't gotten any sort of direct budgetary guidance from the select board and advisory, but I would imagine there's gonna be a little more pressure this year, given how much was funded out of ARPA last year. So I would think that tonight we, as we start to go through, we at least have 3 department heads here tonight. Next week is gonna be DPW, which is obviously a new department head. Our questions should be around need, timing, and any overarching questions of things that are under their purview. And then I think at a later date, we'll come back and talk about funding sources and, if we need to, prioritization, right? If department head A had something in front of us that we thought made a lot of sense, but department head B had something that made a lot more sense and is a higher priority, and you can only fund one, you know, which direction do we go? We don't need to do that tonight. We need to kind of see the whole picture. And I don't know that we have the full picture as much as I'd like it at this point, because I think the schools are still trying to wrestle with a few decisions. And I think, as we'll hear next week from DPW, as Bill gets kind of his feet underneath him in that department, him trying to get his feet underneath him, I would say the 3 we're gonna hear from tonight have plans that align with what we've heard in prior years. And if anything, it removed certain items between the last time we've spoken to them, but we can obviously talk through some of that as we go. So before I bring John Parent over, Steve, that's guest, I'm just gonna ask one more time, just to make sure you're not Steve Holland. Just to make sure I bring you over as panelist if you really are. So if that is Steve Holland, raise your hand, otherwise we'll just keep going with John Parent. Hey, John.
Hey, everyone, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Well, thanks.
Well, welcome back. Thank you for accommodating our various meeting schedules over the past couple of weeks as we try to find the right scheduling. Just to highlight, you submitted a memo as well as, I'll call it probably a 9 to 10 year plan. But this is probably, at least in my time on Capitol, the lightest year we've seen from facilities. And I know it ebbs and flows based on the needs of the buildings and stuff like that, but you're, just to make sure we're on the same page, for at least for purposes of FY25, you're asking for 2 things: $50,000 for South Union School and $100,000 for the annual facilities maintenance article. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I would put this under your purview too, but we also do have the library feasibility that I believe Ryan Donovan will come speak to us at a future point in time, given that that's like the program he's running with MBLC. But we have that quoted under library, not facilities, but I feel like it could be in either category for obvious reasons. So related to FY25, does any committee member have questions for John on either of his 2 submissions? Go ahead, Joe.
The South Union School, what is the $50,000 actually going to be covering specifically?
$50,000 down there, Joe, is want to do some work, especially on the exterior trim paint. I believe that was done probably about 12, 13 years ago when they restored the windows and such. It's been peeling for a few years now. We've been putting it off and putting it off, waiting for a decision to be made on the schools. But we're realistically at a point now where we have to say, look, we don't want damage to occur to the molding. It is a building that is on the National Registry, and the molding is important. The reason I'm keeping the number so low, this is, again, just one of the things we want to do. I could probably just rent a lift next summer and have one of my guys work on this painting. So that's going to save us some money there. Interior stuff, maybe some new carpeting in some places, painting some walls. Anyone who's been down to Youth and Family Service can see what this building can look like when we do it over, and it's fantastic. So it's time to give it some much needed attention down there. I know we're still in a process of making decisions, but in the long run, this is kind of short money. If we're talking possibly 5-7 years, possibly, unless something changes before town meeting, I do believe it's time to do this now. We're at that point.
And I understand some of the maintenance concerns, painting, that sort of thing. Regardless, some of the aesthetic choices are the department heads within the building asking for some of these things, or is this?
Yeah. They've been asking for a couple of years now. I've been putting off as long as I can. But we really now are at that point, and this seems like a good project to do down there, realistically.
And this is a blank number, so it may come in lighter or heavier.
Yes, anyone that's worked with me knows I generally come in lighter.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yes, thank you, Jason. You kind of stole my thunder, and it was something I was thinking about. Not what's on here, but what's not on here. In terms of evening the cost out, if there's anything that could potentially, John, be accelerated with thinking forward with potential schools coming on the capital budget in the next couple of years, new school, whatever it may be. Anything you can think of that would maybe be prudent to push up to even the cost out for for costs that we're going to incur regardless, that maybe we push them forward because the amount that we're going to incur in future years is just going to be too much.
I don't, Jeff, and that would make me nervous if we'd even have to consider doing that. I am looking at next year's HVAC for the town hall, and we're working with Assabet, as you know, now on Corderville Hall, and that's going particularly well. I must say, I am very, very pleased with what I'm seeing down there from all the departments at the school. And I'm going to actually talk with the HVAC department to see if they may be able to do some of the work up at town hall. So rather than moving things forward, I'm going to try to find a way to reduce some of the costs if possible. Can't guarantee they can do it, but I want to look at this. It's one of those things too. If you were to end up keeping South Union, probably would call them down for that too on the HVAC down there as well.
Right. Yeah, I'm not suggesting
we've got a new relationship here.
I'm not suggesting to find things to do, but if there's anything that's just inevitable that we have to do that maybe we push back, but we can bring forward now, because if you look at it, it's 150 now and it's going to go up to 950, and then it's going to be around 850 by 2030. So I don't know if there's anything you can think of. That'd be my challenge.
I can take a look at it again, but I don't see anything major blaring out where it's like red alert needs to be done immediately. If it was, I wouldn't be this light this year. I don't hold back when something needs to be done.
Okay. No, thank you, John.
No problem.
Tony, any questions for facilities? I have a few questions, but before I do, I want to see if anyone has any questions on the future. I think Jeff kind of alluded to it, but did anyone have any questions on kind of like the future overall plan and any of the slotting there? Go ahead, Joe. You're on mute.
Sorry. I had three other thoughts. The DPW doors, is that a $250,000 placeholder, and we're going to replace them sort of individually as needed with an umbrella of 250, or is the plan when something goes wrong to do them all?
No, the goal would be next year. We're just going to do all the remaining ones. We've done, anyone who's been the salt side of the building, salt shed side, we put in those monster doors a few years back, double side, and we've replaced one on the front side. The goal would be to match the remaining, I believe it's 15.
Okay, I remember us talking about this in prior meetings, so I just want to make sure that was on the page. Does it make sense to do the townhouse HVAC and AC at the same time? Because I believe they're 2 separate years.
That was split over 2 years, but if we did have the school do it, we would just go, it might go into 2 school years. Again, assuming they can do it. If not, you could do it at once, but I'd like to spread it over two because it's probably eligible for green community funds. So I'd like to nail 2 years of funds if we can do that.
Okay,
Because it's a nice,
all right.
nice pot to hit.
So that's really sort of a flexible option there. I was also wondering, there was also Corderville Hall, you had $75,000 for wiring replacement in 28. Is there any reason why that's there specifically?
Some of the older wire, but again, I've already talked to the school and we may be handling that with what we're doing right now. So that
Okay,
might
so
be able to come off the capital plan.
All right, okay. Thanks, Jason.
All right, anyone else on facilities?
Yeah, one more
Go,
question.
Jeff.
John, how has the maintenance fund been working out over the past 2 years or 3 years since we've been doing that? Is it 100,000 still sufficient?
It always makes me nervous because I never want to run it to zero. So I always try to roll a little bit. I know sooner or later that's going to catch up with me. I think in the next year or two, we really should look at increasing it because there are some additional projects that I'd like to start doing that we haven't been doing now. Like, for instance, I mentioned to Jason a while back, maybe some LED lighting upgrades in some of the town buildings. Schools are eligible for green community grant funds. Town buildings are not eligible for that. So we're going to need some funding, and I'm looking to replace our part-time electrician right now, the vacancy we have. Once we get him on board or her on board, that would be the perfect time to start doing some of that stuff. I think we can go one more year at 100, but next year, I think we're probably going to have to look at upping that. It's been about, Mark, what'd you say, 12, 13 years on that at 100,000? It's been a long time with inflation.
It has.
So maybe in line with my question, is now the year to, in a lighter year to bump up the balance?
Hey,
Yeah,
if
you don't
wanna
wanna-
give me
you don't
some,
wanna-
I'll gladly take it.
Sorry, Jason, what?
Yeah, you don't want to over appropriate now for a cost that may, but like once you do that, you're basically locking into that. So let's just say you went to 125 in theory. You really want to be using approximately 125 a year, right? I don't have any issue with John rolling a small amount, but you don't want that to become kind of a piggy bank, so to say. That like, because you want to the taxpayer should be taxed in real time for the benefit that they're getting. So if 125 is the right answer because that's what we need to spend to maintain our buildings, then that's what it should be. But I don't know that you want to go too far just because there's not as much going on and we're worried about what may be coming.
Jason, now let me ask you, do you think it may be a better course of action with that? Rather than adding 25 to capital maintenance, we roll it into the operating budget. Again, anytime we can move things into operating that may be either operating or capital, I always think it's better to keep, for accounting purposes, keep it nice and clean as possible.
I think it goes to what you're using it for. So maybe one of the follow-ups, John, is like, just, I know you've provided at random points in time, just where has it gone over the last 2 years? And I think then that may allow capital to weigh in on whether 100 is the right answer. And I know I mentioned this to you in passing at one point, but I think there's a similar discussion coming with the schools. They're what they used to use for capital, right? It was mainly funded by the extended day rental fees. They don't have that anymore, right? So I think one of the things we're going to need to consider is whether this fund or a separate fund, I know you have your views on how that should go, can deal with some of the schools, right? I mean, those buildings candidly are enormous compared to the size of some of the buildings we're talking about that we use 100,000 for. So I think we should make policy decisions that are consistent, right? So if they're putting in their operating, you should have in your operating. If you're putting a special fund, they should have a special fund with obviously the parameters. Obviously, you go to Mark right now if you need to spend something out of it, and there's kind of a check and balance. So I think that probably is something we should further discuss as a group once this committee gets to hear from schools, because I know it's kind of bubbled up this year given where they're at in the kind of the change in their programs. So John, a few points for you just from my perspective. I noticed the townhouse generator creeped back in this year, and that had been removed a few years ago. And we obviously made a I'll call it a strategic decision that capital is very involved in to sell the surplus generator from 21
Mhm.
Main Street, which I know you were at least at the time potentially asking to repurpose over there. My view remains consistent with what we talked about previously. If that's a need of the town, there's plenty of grant funds out there for something like that. I'm
I'll
not
be honest
sure.
with you, Jason, I'm gonna stop you right now. I don't know how that's in there. I scratched that line.
All right.
Because it's only 50,000. That wouldn't even touch it.
And I know it's not
So
this
I can
year,
answer that one real quick.
All right.
Scratch it.
All right. I was also going to ask how you were going to do it for 50,000, but I'll
Yeah,
save that
I'm good.
question.
I'm not that good.
That was
So-
probably just the wiring. That was probably just the prep for it. That had,
Probably
yeah.
the crane. There was probably the crane to bring it from somewhere to one place to another. Okay. So that's one question. The other question is it's similar on the lines of Jeff's question on the overhead doors. We've gone back and forth on this many years. You originally had a phase. We asked you to combine it. We also have a new DPW director that ultimately runs that building day to day and uses it. Is he on board with your plan in terms of timing?
Yes, I spoke with Bill about this.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he'd like to do it next year for sure, and I'm fine with that. So next year's let's make it so.
And the cost that you're presenting to us for next year is assuming we get no grant funding or anything like that from green communities or any other sources you have available to.
Right. And realistically, Jason, I would say you're not going to get green communities on these. The energy savings is not there with overhead doors. It's just not.
Okay. Fair enough. I had asked a question. And then on South Union, right? Obviously, we know the select board continues to discuss this in various iterations. I just want to reiterate, because this is probably going to go into our slides for the committee that when we ultimately go to the select board in advisory, you basically need a decision on the fate of South Union by the time the warrant's finalized, like at least a direction, right? So if they're putting in the warrant sale of real property, as an example, we probably wouldn't advance the South Union 50K.
I'd only recommend advancing it if you took it in the warrant after the sale of the building. If a sale was to fail, then you'd want to advance the 50,000.
But basically what you're saying is if the select board can't successfully dispose of that building on or around or by June 30th of 2024, this has to happen. This 50,000 of maintenance has to happen for us to continue to maintain the structure there and to make sure that people can continue to work in that building. Is that
I would
correct?
recommend it. If we're going to keep it as a piece of property for any time, like 2 to 5 years, this is short money for that amount of time.
What if they say we need another year?
I'm nervous with that wood outside, Jason. Not going to lie.
Okay,
It's getting wet.
I think the goal is to get them to make a decision one way or another. I'm not going to weigh in on what the decision, right? Like, but I think if we provide parameters, right? Because that's what we basically raised our hand on last year and said, look, select board, we have a ton coming for South Union next 3 years. It looks like you're able to mitigate a lot of that, which is great, but we need you to be aware of this. That I just think is helpful context. So, Jeff, did you have something on that?
Is there anything in the capital maintenance fund that could be used for that in the event that there's some uncertainty?
It would depend on where the fund lands and how much it's going to cost us to do it. Because you're going to have 50,000, it's 50% of the fund.
Right.
So, we'd have to look at it that time. It would not be my preference. Put it that way, Jeff.
Thank you.
I think I know this town uses free cash differently than other towns, but Mark, one of the things we could talk about with Brian is whether this ends up, this particular item, if there is uncertainty, whether it becomes a free cash article as opposed to an appropriation, which then doesn't raise taxes, but allows the select board to then just return it. Again, I don't need an answer on that tonight, but I think all my line of question here, John, is just to get the select board to decide what path they want to go down. I realize they have a lot of different views on their plate, so I'm not trying to rush it, but at the same time, our goal is to educate as well of the needs.
I think the best thing to do, Jason, is just to try to figure out from capital's perspective what's on the plate. And then once you get that figured out, then we can, look at what the funding sources look like and how we want to handle it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. My final question for you, John, and it's more of an observation, I don't expect an answer, is Corderville's adding up, right? In terms of some of the stuff that's coming at Corderville Hall, in terms of some of the items that you have on the capital plan. I know you spoke to the wiring in particular, that may come out, but I think that's just something capital needs to pay attention to as we think about the uses of some of these buildings going forward is similar to South Union. Is Corderville going to be in our inventory still if a school consolidation occurs?
Right. The only thing
Okay.
I'd mention with regard to that, Jason, is as I've mentioned in the past, always keep in mind with facilities capital plan, it is extremely fluid. So if
Mhm.
you've seen something on it, I get a year or two out and I'm looking at this equipment going, I can get 6 more years out of this.
Yeah.
I don't like to replace things prematurely. Even though
Well,
they
and-
say it gets 10 years. If I can get 15 for you, I'm gonna get 15 for you.
And that's evident by obviously the shift that we saw this year, especially with some of the South Union articles. So, any other questions for facilities? All right. John, I'm going to have you stay because we're likely going to get into green communities with the chief, and I'm going to bring Chief Newell over. Hey, Chief.
Hey everyone.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think to frame this conversation, you have, I'll call it a light capital plan. It's one request this year, right? Related to the vehicles. But I think before we go into the vehicles, I just a thank you, because I think some of the items you did have on the capital plan, you've resolved through grant funding. In I'll call it sustainable type funding. So I thank you for making our job just a tad bit easier. And we will, I'll probably put it on a future agenda just to take formal action to make sure that those are memorialized in the capital plan. But obviously I know you've been sending updates and copying me when you get the awards to the select board. So the committee has copies of those letters in our file tonight. But just wanted to thank you there for just laying the playing field of making it a little easier for us on that piece.
No problem.
So you kind of probably heard it with the discussion with John. Our main focus tonight is FY25 requests, which we have you in for 2 cruisers at approximately $75,000 each. And you have no other capital needs major capital needs upcoming for a few years. I just want to make sure that that aligns with kind of your expectations.
Yes, we still just I believe you were going to talk to Brian just to make sure, but we do have the Taser lease program still in play,
Yeah.
which would be about 19 grand.
Yeah, so he's looking into where that should go, whether it goes in his lease article or the operating budget, but he'll follow back up. But capital really doesn't have a say once we kind of approve adding that, which we did a couple of years ago to the plan. So I think we're good there. So I guess in terms of the cruisers, I provided a copy of the mileage to everyone in our packet, and that people can see the type of mileage. But I think it'd be important for you to just kind of expand on why 2 cruisers, and just with full disclosure, our capital plan called for 1 cruiser this year, and really that capital plan hadn't been refreshed since Chief Paulus, right? So Chief Paulus had a plan of 2 cruisers, 1 cruiser, 2 cruisers, 1 cruiser. So I just think it's really important to kind of identify why 2 are needed, other than kind of the mileage data that we have in front of us, and then we can kind of talk about any other obstacles that are in front of you.
Yeah. So, that was put in play, and I really have to say, for operation wise for this department, it's just not working. Back to Chief Kaleri, we were getting 2 cruisers every year. And then
what year was that, just for everyone's benefit?
It was around 2002, 2000. I got here in 2002. So it was around that time. And then Chief Weber, 2006, he was still getting 2 cruisers every year as well. But we've gone away from that, and I'm starting to see how the fleet is suffering from that. A majority of my fleet is approaching 100,000 miles. My 6 frontline cars are only 2 of them, the newer ones, about 50,000, but every other one is approaching 100,000 miles. And these are cars that are used 24/7 or around the clock. So I'm really getting concerned about it, and I feel like it's just not sustainable for this department if we don't have 2 cruisers per year. And then we're also running into issues, supply chain issues. So I don't know if that's the topic you want to go on to next or.
Guess, does anyone have any questions or comments on the need for two? Go ahead, Joe.
It's not really a question so much about the need for two at this present time, but moving forward, if we're moving over to the hybrids and electrics after that, are we likely to get better mileage out of those cars moving forward, or are we really gonna be working on the same mileage per car sort of turn in for the fleet moving forward?
We may have to adjust in the future, but as of right now, we can't even get the hybrids. Still haven't received the two that we approved from last town meeting. That's been bumped out till March of next year. And my cruisers right now, like I said, approaching 100,000 miles. So there's a huge delay from Ford. They basically have stopped taking orders. They've stopped filling orders for the 23s. They won't start making the 24s until January, and they're only going to do January through February of the 24s, and then they're going to stop and then go right to the 25s, which are going to jump significantly in price. I was given an estimate, 2 new hybrids, if ordered during for FY25, would be about 80,000 a piece for hybrids. And for gas, we're looking at least 3,000 less per car.
And do we have estimates on fuel, the difference, right? Like, does that
3,000 less. Yeah.
So you're saying we spend 3,000 less a year on hybrid fuel than we do on like a gas vehicle? That's
I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. No, I don't know. I'm not sure about that difference in itself.
okay. John, do you have any data around that from the fleet? You're on mute, John.
Yeah.
Still on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm looking for that right now, actually, for you. Give me a couple seconds. Three. On 2 vehicles, let me see here. Gas savings annually. Almost $4,000 a year. Oh, sorry, that's gallons. Well, sorry, it's way more than that. So almost 4,000 gallons a year on 2 vehicles. So whatever gasoline is, let's say $3 a gallon, about 12,000 a year in savings.
Which we would see that through the DPW budget. Obviously, it's not going to impact the chief's operating budget per se. Okay, so I'm hearing no questions or constructive feedback on the need for 2. It sounds like, Chief, then it comes down to pricing, which we're carrying 75. We know from prior years you'll adjust it plus or minus a few thousand as obviously the supply chain issues resolve itself. But I think then it begs the question for future years, what type of cruisers you're going to buy, which I don't think we need to make a decision on tonight. I think we can word any warrant article like that, but it sounds like if we were to approve hybrids only at the March 2024 meeting, which is what we're talking about tonight, you could be looking at a significant delay in receiving them, much like what's happening with the March 2023 approvals that you have that you still don't have in your possession. That's really the issue, right?
Yeah, and that's my concern, is the significant delay and then the significant cost. And obviously with our cruises, I mean, we need this. I think the 2-in-1 is the reason why we're in the position we're in right now, where my entire fleet's approaching 100,000. So.
You have
Just a
something, Jeff?
question, Chief. You mentioned Ford. Any other models you would consider that maybe are easier to get, or is it the same issue across the board?
There are, I mean, a lot of it is the issues of the microchips and the delay and like the stuff that's going on across seas. But you know, we are seeing that it's a little bit easier to get like a Chevy if you know, we're talking couple of months, like a Chevy Tahoe, couple months delay versus, you know, I'm coming up on almost a year, you know, so I think that's the concern, is that, you know, Ford is really, they're not prioritizing first responder vehicles right now. So if there's a possibility that we can find another manufacturer, I think that's something that we should really look at as well.
I think it's probably important to note that this isn't a Southborough only issue,
Right.
right? Like this is something you and your colleagues are all facing, and I think it impacts even the fire side as well to a lesser extent.
It is nationwide. You know, just doing a little research, I'm seeing this is happening all over the country, where, you know, larger departments are still waiting, you know, they're waiting on 40 vehicles, and they're still waiting. And it's, you know, sort of these smaller departments like ours, it's, we're in the back of the line.
Go ahead, Joe.
I mean, what you're advocating here, is it really just not only buying 2 cruisers a year, but changing the pattern to different cars and buying different models, as Jeff was suggesting, in order to speed up the replacement? I mean, I don't disagree that having a first responder out there trying to race through traffic in a 90,000, 100,000 mile car isn't exactly tops on my list.
Right.
If the way that we have to speed up the cycle is to mix some other cars in, is that going to be, you know, to Jeff's point, is that really a problem for us to do?
I don't see it as a problem at all. And in fact, like you know, if it were a Chevy Tahoe, there's actually more space in the back for emergency equipment. There's actually a presentation that one of my officers did, that there's far more room in the back of these Chevy Tahoes that a lot of these departments are switching to because of the issues at Ford. And with that more space and the easier availability, they're becoming the go-to vehicle.
And I think the one thing that, from a full disclosure perspective, which is why I think we asked John to stay, is there are requirements to maintain our green community status. So even like that and there are changing requirements in the next fiscal year that would be different for police cruisers. I don't think we need to sit here and have a lesson tonight on that, because I think, being a realist, if you've got 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts that are facing the same issue, I think guidance could change. So I don't think we should try to solve a problem on our own here tonight. I'm hearing support for 2 cruisers, absent obviously other capital needs, Chief, that other department heads are going to bring forward in front of us, which are candidly significant. And I'm hearing, no matter which way you cut this, at least now, whether you go hybrid, gas, Tahoe, Explorer, roughly 75,000 will get you what you need for the vehicle, absent major price increases.
Yes, between 75 and 80 would be is the quote, and that's, again, that's the earliest we can order of the 25s. We can't even order you know, Ford could decide to drop our current order, which we have from town meeting, which was 70,000 and 71,000 for the 2 vehicles. So meaning that the next time we could actually even start a new order, it would start at that new rate.
Mark, I don't know if you're able to answer this, or if we have to talk offline to Brian about it, but similar to my comment to John about free cash, I think we need to think about whether cruiser, like if let's just say we had a cruiser only article at the town meeting and the funding source was free cash, not appropriation, that would give the chief the authority on March, whatever date, the Monday following town meeting, if that was approved, he could go and spend it then, as opposed to waiting until July 1st to get a PO from Carla. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, as long as the funding is available.
Okay. So I would, in free cash is in an okay spot for this year. Do we get our certification yet?
We did.
Okay. So I just think that's an avenue, regardless of which way the chief goes, if he's waiting 9 to 12 months, gas hybrid, something we should just think about doing a few things differently as we finalize the pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. We can, like I said, once you set the plate, we can take a look at how we want to fund some of these, which makes the most sense.
Any other questions for the chief while we have him? All right. Thank you, chief, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night.
Have a good
Thanks,
night.
John.
All right. The red chief will be joining us in a few minutes. I gave him a heads up around 7:30. So what I thought we would do in the meantime is just level set them where I think we're at for capital for this year. Those two departments I candidly put first because I think the needs are smaller, right, in the grand scheme of things, and more self-explanatory. Fire, I think, is going to be a more involved conversation as we go through the next steps. But DPW is a one agenda topic for next week, and I'll just tell you, and you can kind of see it in the document that's at least in the capital plan. Bill took a very fresh look at DPW capital from where Karen had left it, and there's no shortage of things there, absent what we already know, roads and sidewalks. So the DPW capital, just for big picture, is greater than, if we just appropriated everything there, is greater than any capital amount we've appropriated for all town departments in any one year, at least upon an original submission. Now, there's a ton of grant funding opportunities that obviously ignores all the other departments, but just to give you some context, and that's very natural with the department head. But that's, I think, where we're going to have the tough decisions when we balance it against, obviously, the public safety chiefs and the facilities. The good news is recreation doesn't have any big projects this year coming in front of us. They have basically trying to rest a field for $10,000, and IT doesn't have anything major. They have a phone system upgrade. So we're really looking at a few departments with major capital needs, but it goes back to some of the questions that Jeff was asking when John was on, is like, how do we clear the deck, so to say, without obviously spending too early for some of these needs. So I think that's the perspective we're going to have to take once we hear from each of these department heads of prioritizing for FY25, realizing it's going to be a jolt to the taxpayers because $500K came off the books through ARPA last year. So if you actually look at what we presented at town meeting, it was a cakewalk because there's nothing in there. Now this year, we're going to be back to a full-fledged capital article that is going to require some justification. But then we all know what's happening just much more broadly outside of Southborough in terms of everything costs more, right? So if our capital budget's staying level, we're actually decreasing our capital budget in the big grand scheme of things. And is that appropriate? So one of the things we'll have probably 2 meetings from now is Brian had sent us a memo on stabilization and some recommendations from the finance team. So we'll have to talk about that as well, which I realize some of you have heard in various instances, but that's kind of when we look at kind of where we're at overall capital and then looking ahead, something we need to focus on. So with that, I will bring over Chief Achilles. Hi, Chief.
Well, good evening, everybody.
How you doing?
Excellent. How about you guys?
Great. So Chief, I know you didn't have the benefit of listening to John and your fellow public safety chief, but we're focusing primarily on FY25 tonight. There may be questions in the future about some of your things that are a little further out. I imagine that will come with the tower discussion. But really what everyone has your submissions, right? Like we don't need, right? I didn't ask you to come with any presentations or anything like that. This will probably be a little bit of back and forth, but I'm pretty much going to go one by one through your FY25 requests, see if the committee has any questions, let you react in any way, shape, or form. And they're in candidly no order. And I think before we do that, though, I wanted to start with two things. One, and I don't know if everyone caught this, and I know we sent an email on this a couple months ago, but the chief, along with his counterparts, secured a 3-town grant for the SCBA's. That's no short of $300,000 that we should have been talking about tonight. So I think, thank you, because I think that just makes our job easier, and I think there's obviously no doubt that that was a needed asset. And I know, back to the days of Chief Morrow, they had been trying to get grants for that. So obviously an asset that your department needs that really we're only spending 5 or 10% of footing 5 or 10% of the cost of. With that being said, though, I just, for full disclosure, and I don't expect the chief to have the answer to this, we do have a match on that grant. We had previously approved it at a prior meeting to match that. It was $30,000. I think it's uncertain when that payment actually is going to have to be made, in how that's going to work. So if it happens before town meeting, it likely will be dealt with by the finance team within the confines of FY24, the year we're currently in. But by chance it goes and can be paid after July 1st of next year, probably not likely, but just that could be something we need to consider funding in this year. And then, Mark, I don't want to stray us too far, but obviously there are prior year authorizations you could do in a town meeting too, right? To adjust this year.
Yeah, we've also put advisory on notice as well.
Okay. It's a very good problem to have.
Jason, just to answer that question, we were fortunate that we were able to get delivery of all 3 towns. We get delivery about 2 weeks ago.
Oh.
And the units are going to be going in service. Actually, they went in service Saturday. I spoke to Mark and Brian about this, that Ashland is the lead on the grant and the fiduciary, and basically they sent us an invoice for our portion. And I asked Brian if we could start processing that as soon as possible, because of course Ashland is upfronting the money.
Yeah. So clearly not an FY25 thing. So Mark, I guess.
Yeah.
You're dealing with advisory. We've done our job. It's in the capital plan. But if anything comes back to us, it needs to come back to us, let us know. But pretty much a done deal at this point. The second piece I will just point out, related to fire, is the status of the ambulance fund. So as everyone knows, it's been in the committee for a while. We do regularly post what's in the ambulance fund, and Brian has taken a step further and taken at least some of the chief's requests and kind of scheduled out what that would do to the ambulance fund if all approved in this year. And it's just tighter than normal, absent a sudden uptick in revenue there. But it's very tough to predict revenue because it's all based on obviously call volume. So I just think we've been fortunate over the last couple of years that we've been able to appropriate most of the fire and candidly some of the police capital out of either donations or the ambulance fund without hitting the general fund. If we strongly believe in each of the chief's requests this year, there may be a general fund impact. And obviously then that leads to kind of taxation. I get it's all cyclical. You could take more out of the ambulance fund every year and then put everything through the general fund. It's somewhat geography, but this may be a different year in terms of how we view some of these things. So I just wanted to make sure, people understood that walking into this, especially given some of the size of the numbers we're about to talk about. Any questions on kind of that landscape or how that works? Okay. All right, Chief. Well, I didn't do this on purpose, but the ambulance is the first one. So obviously not a short amount of money, and obviously very different from prior ambulance requests that capital has seen. So we have it for $551,000 currently. I think it's worth just explaining why now, why the cost, and how the supply chain, very similar to what we just dealt with Chief Newell, will work on this.
Yeah, and if I could preface just in general, the capital, recognizing we, especially with the ambulance we moved up, is we took out or moved out 4 items and zeroed out the self-contained breathing apparatus to kind of lessen the load on this year. So I think going into this, it's important for capital advisory and the select board know that we've adjusted our numbers and prioritized our requests based on service delivery. And that leads to the ambulance where we had it in 2026 originally. I think for some of you on the board realize that we ordered an ambulance 2.5 years ago. It'll be here in February, which is it's the supply chain and anything of vehicles right now, and this is industry-wide, you can expect an ambulance will take, if you're going to spec it out and build it, up to 2 years, if not more, and fire apparatus 3 to 4 years. So that's kind of that's the premise that we're operating on. Also, the cost is significant. And as we were asked to get quotes, and I think everybody, things that the fire department submitted, we submitted supporting documents. You'll see that these are their best guess numbers, and numbers will go up after July 1st, right when we're allowed to purchase it. So the ambulance was moved up 1 year just on that premise because we're behind on replacing the older one 2 years, over 2.5 years. So our first run ambulance is getting used a lot more. So we need reliable and predictable ambulance. And again, even if we were approved to order this after July 1st of 2024, it could be up to 2 years out. So I think it's important that we do not request this in 2026, knowing that we might not get it for 2 more years after that. So that's why that's been moved up. And along with that, we moved up the power stretcher that's supposed to go in it. That's the patient cot. These are battery operated hydraulic lifts so that we don't have to lift the patients. And again, this is our best estimate. And we separate it out from the ambulance because unfortunately, we could not include it in the ambulance because of the cost. It would make the ambulance look outrageous. So, and we've had a pretty good deal right now. Even in FY24, we have one on order to line up with the ambulance that we're getting replaced. So those are those 2 items.
Questions or comments on those 2? We'll take them together.
And I will just add, just as a planning thing, we can't really do it with the older ambulance, but we're getting to there was an occasion within the last 4 months that we had no ambulances available due to mechanical failure and repair. So we're actually, in the future, one of our considerations, if we can keep them in good shape and replace them in shorter timeframes, is maybe try to keep one for a little while. I know a couple towns are starting to do that and have a third because just the challenges of being out of service. So that's something we're going to start investigating over the next 2 years is, do we keep one not fully stocked, but ready to go in service if we need it? And then we might look at cost sharing with some of our mutual aid partners. So that's on the horizon because we can't not have ambulances. So
I have a few questions on the ambulance.
I think Joe has a question too.
I'll let Joe go first then.
in terms of talking about the third ambulance chief, do we have a ratio by which population growth versus number of ambulances that we'll need to be in active service?
No, it's because we're an ambulance service, you need at least two, and realistically, it's primary ambulance and backup are reserve. Today was a good example. Both ambulances were out on simultaneous calls. And what we're finding, it's not so much population, and we've been tracking call volume and simultaneous call volume. And that's been simultaneous call volume is about 14%, between 11 and 14% of our calls. But we also we're trying to track when the unit's out of service for mechanical repairs. So again, I know a smaller town to our north, I think it's Bolton, they recognized in the last 2 years that the same thing's happening to them. Is you lose an ambulance and then another one goes out of service, you have no ambulances. And we actually used a loaner from another town for 72 hours. And of course, you understand that if we don't have an ambulance, we don't generate revenue. So it's more indicative of age of ambulances and the frequency of calls to make sure you have a reserve. It's really
I'm also thinking about how much the response time is affected when we lack ambulances for the populace that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty significant, and we're trying to minimize that, because you're not that we don't use them anyway, but you want to minimize the amount of times that you have to do that. But Westboro's a great resource for us, Framingham Ambulance and Marlboro, but they're coming from locations further away.
Yeah, and that concerns me. I mean, I this committee's heard me talk about we have 300 units of 40B property. We have the MBTA Community Act coming, and I was interested in understanding, how that population growth would be affecting the vehicles necessary, as well as personnel that might also be necessary if we need more to respond to the populace. So something.
And I'll do this real quick, Joe, is that typically there's certain types of occupancies that will increase your demand for service.
Okay.
Residential typically doesn't, for the size and scope of it, because residential is like we do now. The POC and a certain occupancy located in a certain area by itself doesn't increase calls. But if you had a higher risk occupancy, like a retirement community, a nursing home, continuous care retirement community, senior living, that will really start driving your calls up. But residential, and I'll give Madison Place as a good example, is not our single most response location.
Thanks, Chief.
That's a pretty consolidated residential occupancy.
All right. So I'm just going to go on the record of we need to appropriate this as soon as possible. Given, right, we appropriated an ambulance 2.5 years ago and we still don't have it in place. I think it's one of, right, as much as I value all departments in town, right, Joe's questions about actually being able to show up. Can't show up without an ambulance. That's at least 10 minutes, at least, right? And if you just think in terms of dollar signs, it's one of the few assets in town we actually have that generates sustainable, consistent revenue, right? And which leads to my line of questioning. Chief, the email that you submitted said 380, and then they added a huge escalator onto it. So Mark, back to some of the questioning we just had with police, even. If in whatever the date of town meeting is, I can't remember off the top of my head, March 20-something. 23rd. We appropriate an ambulance through the ambulance fund. When can the chief get a PO for that?
So if the funds are available and it's something we don't have to appropriate, he can, we can order that, the next day. that Monday, 2 days later.
So this would likely be an asset we'd still wait 2 years for. So we actually wouldn't be issuing a check until at least FY26, it sounds like.
Well, if I may, Jason, and that's correct. If a dealer had a demonstrator unit that met or had one delivered that was on lot that met our needs, I would try to get it earlier for 2 reasons. One, to save money, right? Because the longer you put it out, the more expensive it's going to be. And 2, to stave off the delivery time to the town.
Well, that was question 1B.
Yeah.
That I
So-
had is demo, because that was the title of the email, demo unit. So all right, fine. So play that out. You may have a payment in FY25 then.
Right, but I think right now I have to at least present a likely liability of that 551,000. Does that make sense? I wouldn't reduce that now on the assumption we would get one in before July 1st.
Well, I think we need to go back and at least ask them if we order by March 31st. Should we go with 380? Should we go with 4 something? Or should we go with 380 grossed up by the 40 to 45% in the email?
I will ask that question, but I can tell you with all the dealers I've talked to get the initial quote as requested by Capital, they said, this was back in September,
Mm-hmm.
if you got one today, it would be this much.
Yeah. Well, because part of my theory here is we have the ability to adjust a number until the warrant gets posted, which prior history is the warrant doesn't get posted too early in time. So I'm fine carrying your 551, but I think for purposes of modeling, especially what Brian does for some of the spreadsheets for us,
right,
I think we need to be modeling a few scenarios, especially he's the one that controls how long he's going to bond this for as well. And just because we need to also make sure we can actually appropriate it through the ambulance fund, as crazy as that sounds. But I think it's helpful to know that 551 may not actually be the reality, and that there is room to bring this down. Again, I hear all your cautions and fully agree with your approach. But I think we have a responsibility too to not over appropriate and or put guardrails in the article around like returning funds, all that fun stuff.
Right, I understand.
Okay. And just to reconfirm what you said about the power stretcher is if appropriate at town meeting, you would just go and buy it now, put it in service, and then just transfer it to the new ambulance to stave off kind of any sort of inflationary pressure there.
That is one approach, but the installation, you have to take the other one out.
You mean the power load piece?
Yeah, so that's why we haven't even taken delivery of I might have, I'm not sure. We held off buying the one in FY24 until we knew that ambulance was coming. Because we didn't want just to sit here and you couldn't put it in the older ambulance.
So how would you feel about the number then?
modifications? But I would try to buy it as soon as possible.
But so how good do you feel if you have to wait 2 years? The ambulance doesn't show up for 2 years, and then you're trying to retrofit that ambulance in 2 years. Like you may buy the stretcher, but not the labor. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we might buy this. We might purchase the stretcher in later FY25.
Okay,
But not install it in the older ambulance.
that part makes sense. Okay. All right. Any other questions or feedback on ambulance or power stretcher? Okay. Next item is the paramedic defibrillators. We talked a lot about this one last year. The chief ultimately pulled it because they were looking at different units, hoping for a fall town meeting. We didn't have one. So it comes forward. So we've talked about this one a lot before. So I don't think there's any background needed unless someone needs a reminder on it or any further explanation. Okay. We talked about the power stretcher already, which leads us to the tower. That's your last item, right, Chief, for this year?
Yes.
Okay. Before we go to the tower, I also just want to make sure people realize that the chief removed, I think he sort of mentioned this earlier, he removed the PPE that we've been carrying for quite a few years, which I think we're now seeing the fruits of that program, right? Is instead of we're appropriating when we need it, as opposed to just appropriating to keep something stable, which obviously may or may not go to something new this year. But Mark, I know obviously we're fresh off of donations with the nonprofits in town, and they used to really like that item. So obviously there's some things in here that we could still use some help with, even if it is an ambulance fund article, but just to make sure everyone's clear that that item is not there, but that's on purpose from the chief. So, all right. So Chief, we touched on the tower last year. I think for those that don't have a background, I think it's important to walk everyone through what the tower does, maybe some of the history that predates you in terms of how it was purchased, what kind of a monumental expense that was for the town at the time, what you're proposing with the 200,000, and then any other options that we should be considering or you want feedback on in terms of the path forward on this asset.
Right. So again, the department in its inventory has a 100-foot aerial device with a bucket on it at the end. If you've been to the department or you go to our website, you'll see a picture of it. It was purchased, I think, close to 13, 14 years ago. It was a significant purchase for the town, recognizing the risk of access to larger buildings, so industrial buildings, apartment buildings, but also it provides the reach for access from where it would park in normally a street to the house. So drive around Southborough, I think you see a lot of long driveways, a lot big setbacks. So even though the residential structures aren't what you'd think 100 feet high or 75 feet high, we need the reach. It's incumbent that we have an aerial device. That's our responsibility. We do use assets from other communities in shared mutual response. But, you know, the town and I think the fire department, I recognize we need to maintain an aerial device. Okay, so that's, I've been here about 4.5 years. We recognize that the unit is not the first unit out the door, but supports responses like Sears Road. I mean, last year we had a few fires, chimney fires. We share with our mutual aid partners. And the reason for that is we're trying to extend its life. Running it first due would just put more hours and miles on it. So we're trying to extend its life. I've spoke to this committee and other committees before. It's slightly underpowered. And that was just a result of when they try to purchase it, they try to save some money and be fiscally conscious when they purchase it because was a pretty significant amount and they got donations. But they used an older motor, a 2-year older motor that they put in it, and it probably not quite enough oomph for the vehicle, and it's not really geared correct for the weight. And we've recognized that. So in general, we try to look at a 20-year replacement on it. Last year, I presented to the capital advisory that we had an inspection of the vehicle and recognized there was some, the frame, if you looked at it, had some rust and corrosion. Some of the paint had some, what we'd call rust coming through or corrosion starting to come through. And our concern is if we don't do anything for that, we could have a failure of the frame. and the vehicle will go out of service. When we presented last year, it was around $110,000, maybe $100,000. Again, we pulled it because of some of the questions, discussions. We thought it might get revisited in the fall meeting. We didn't have a fall meeting. So we went out as we were asked to in September, got another quote. Of course, the costs are just, the cost increase was substantial. So we have a quote right now that we think is good, that will get us at least till July, after July, about $200,000. And when we come to do that work, we'll prioritize to make sure the frame is sandblasted, painted, corrosion's taken care of, any repainting that needs to be done, with the goal of trying to get that vehicle out. I'm just trying to look where I had it. Tower 21, at least to 2029. As I said to you, that for the foreseeable future, you order a vehicle, it's going to be up to 4 years to get, unless you can get one that's already built. So again, we moved this up a little bit, and we recognize that some of our initial estimates, again, I'm projecting out 4 years, that it could be, to replace that vehicle as it is, could be $1.9 million. So our goal is to try initially to get this unit to last minimally to 2029, knowing that it might have to go to like 2030, 2033. Okay. It was asked last year what would happen if we didn't do this, and I can tell you that we could have a failure of the frame, and that's it. It's out of service. And we already started this year. It's been out of service probably a total of 2 weeks cumulative, just for repairs, maintenance, brakes. So we're cautiously optimistic that we can make this vehicle last. But we're going to have to start, if we don't do anything, we're going to have to start carrying some more money in our operational budget. So that is the proposal, is to fund to make sure that it is in service, excuse me, and that it lasts. There's two other options. The first option is don't do anything. And the day that vehicle goes out of service or has a significant mechanical or structural issue, it goes out of service and we don't do anything. That's not my recommendation. And I know my mutual aid partners that we share resources aren't going to provide us would not prefer to provide us an aerial apparatus on every call we need it on, because that would be supplanting our service, not supporting. The other option is to fund a replacement of an aerial device, but of a different design. And in some of our preliminary discussions with some of our vendors, you know, if it was approved in FY25, you could get something for $1.2, $1.3 million. If they happen to have one on the lot as a demo, we might even be able to get one for $1 million or $800,000. I cannot give you the exact amount we would need, because the industry is too, it's not stable enough to be able to do that. I used to be able to do this pretty easy and be within 50 grand 2 years out. I can't do that. So basically, this item is to right now to make sure we spend the money to repair the vehicle so it lasts at least to 2029. So 4 years, knowing that we might need to make it last past 2029. So that's where we are. The other two options do nothing, and the vehicle might go out of service. Or the third option is put money in 2025 so that we basically spend $1.3 million potentially on a new piece of apparatus that's an aerial, but maybe of a different scope and size. And I think this will be enough to generate questions.
I'm sure there's no questions on. I'll open it for questions, comments. Right, Jeff, then Joe. And you're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Chief. What does that mean a little more in terms of what would its capabilities be that what would you be losing if you were to go down that third option from a different type of apparatus?
So, I'm prepared to do a more formal presentation with visuals to give you some idea. But right now we own a 100-foot, basically it's called a tower truck with a bucket at the end. It has 2 rear axles, so it's a pretty substantial piece of apparatus with a pump on it. There are other aerial devices like it would look more like a smaller fire truck with a single rear axle, but with just a ladder. And I think if you watch the news, and I can share, I would be prepared to present this option if you wanted to, and give you an idea what it looks like in capacity. It might be only an 80-foot ladder. So the reach would be less. It might be more maneuverable to get up some of the driveways in town. We're a little bit different. If you were in Marlborough or Framingham, a lot of houses are close to the streets. Our town, there are very few houses close to the streets. If you drive around, you'll know where they are. But most things are a significant driveway or a very large front yard, and you need to reach. So we'd be giving up some operational features to make sure we still had an aerial device for most of our calls, and we would ask for our mutual aid partners to support it if we need the larger one on scene. But I don't, again, as I said earlier, I don't want to ask towns to provide the primary unit. So I think operationally that would be something internally we'd have to kind of vet out, but I think it's a reasonable option. I think, and this is a poor presentation, but it would look more something like this. So that instead of what you've seen, so that's my quick presentation.
Well, depending on where we land, Chief, we will let you, whether it be in writing or come back quickly, just present the whatever pictures you think are appropriate to answer some of the questions. Is that it for you, Jeff?
I think so, yes. I appreciate it.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
So we'd be losing some operational capability. Okay. And if we did buy a smaller vehicle, what's likely to be the lifespan of that vehicle?
I think you're still looking at 20 to 25 years.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And
as I say that, Joe, is that because we don't have a large fleet that distributes the calls, we're a community that basically, we're finding this very true with the ambulances, that we've had to shorten up their replacement cycle. I think the fire apparatus is kind of the same boat. I think 20 years is our goal. And knowing that we might have some flexibility if you design it right, to maybe get a couple more years, if, you know, based on replacement availability. But I think a 25-year piece of apparatus, I don't know if they're out there anymore.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. But the other thing would be to string this out an extra, hopefully 5 to 8 years, based on what you're saying, and then
Yep.
we'd be looking to replace it with either, as you're saying, a cheaper model, or if we were going to go the same route, it'd be about 1.9 million, or
And
well,
that's-
in
and that-
today's dollars,
In today's dollars,
it'd be about
it's about
1.9 million. But we've all seen what's happening with vehicles, so you know, probably more like 3
Joe,
million.
I'll just I want to make sure I say this correctly. 1.9 is our best estimate that it will cost then. If I were to do it now, it could be 1.5 million, 1.6 million. My peers and I are always looking at, like, Framingham was going to buy a new rescue truck. They said 4 years and to delivery and a lot of money. They were able to adjust their specifications to get a demo or spec model earlier. This would require, if we did it in Southborough, require a little more flexibility from the boards, that you may not get the exact model and size spec initially, because we're going to try to leverage a lot of things. And one of the other areas I think Jason may be aware of is a lot of the fire truck manufacturers are now saying this is the price, and we'll just pretend the number is 600,000. However, you have to carry a contingency up to 10%, because we have to cover a cost if the chassis goes up. So all the fire departments, my peers I know, are trying to come up with creative ways to not have that happen, but we're at the mercy of the manufacturers. But I'm committed that whatever makes sense for the town and the department to deliver services efficiently and cost effectively without giving up too much, I'm committed to. But I wish I could give you sharp, hard numbers. It's just not. And the further we go out, the harder it becomes.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. So the $200,000 would hopefully stretch this vehicle for about 7 to 8 years.
I would hope so, but like I said,
No guarantees. No guarantees. It's not new equipment.
Right.
Doesn't
And
come.
that's the goal.
Okay. Thanks, Chief.
Other comments or questions on this? So, Chief provided us 3 options. Option 1 is to move forward with kind of a refurbishment for $200K. Option 2 was to do nothing, which obviously he advised against. And option 3 was this revised approach in operations in using kind of a demo truck, but it would require obviously a little bit different way of thinking in terms of how we approach capital, right? We usually have something right in front of us and say, this is the bright shiny object we're going to go buy. So I'm going to tee this up in a second and ask where everyone's kind of at. It's not a formal vote, but just I think we need to provide the chief direction of what more we need on this, because this is not going to be a short discussion with the select board or advisory when we get there. But I think they always want our view, and I think we need to come with a view. It can be split, it can be unanimous, any of those 3 options, or maybe there's an option we haven't proposed yet, but I'm not aware of any. But I guess if we went with option 3 for a second, I think just to be clear, we would have to put a number out there that's probably larger than we want to spend or expect to spend, and probably put some guardrails around the authorizations that the chief would have to come back just in a public meeting, not a town meeting or anything where you're going to get 100 voters in a room, just to say, all right, there's a demo on the lot for 1.1 million. It meets all the needs of my department. please sign here sort of thing, as opposed to, I think there usually is resistance to just giving a blank check, because obviously you give blank check, people go and spend it no matter, no offense, chief, right? Just, I think the optics, right, of this is just going to be different if we went with option 3. So, and then obviously the funding question that would go along with that too, right, is it would be early in the capital plan. It's not expected. How long would Brian bond that out for? If, let's just say, we bought it, ended up buying a year from half from now, then what does that do to the tax rate, right? Is it a 10-year bond? You know, that's not going to be insignificant, but it's also not going to meaningfully drive other decisions that we make as a town. And I'm thinking back to Jeff's comment when John Parent was here. FY29 is a magical year, right, in our capital plan, because that's likely when you'd have whatever you do with the schools. That's about like when your first payments are going to be due, right? So just thinking about trying to appropriate, you know, in and around that time period is going to be tougher. And obviously we don't know what's going to happen with pricing. But I assume everyone's comfortable with the assumption that it's not going to get stable anytime soon. It's just a matter of how soon. So I just want to make sure everyone's clear on how the mechanics would work. If option 3 was something we started to explore, it'd kind of be a blanket approval on the concept with probably a higher number than we want. We'd have to identify guardrails around that. So anyone want to go first with where they're at? All right, Jeff, you're off mute. So
Off mute. So, oh, Tony.
So I don't recall. So how long do these machines last, Chief, again?
Usually about 20 years.
And how long are we in on the current one?
Well, we'll be in the 14th year, I believe, this year.
I see. So if we put 200 grand in, we get, if we get another 6 or 7 years in,
That's-
then at the end of it. In my opinion, we should pursue an alternate vehicle sooner than wait until 2029. That's my opinion.
Okay, Jeff? So it's option 3, it sounds like, Tony.
Yeah, I don't think we should repair the current one. I think we should look for because I don't know, it's like a lot of things are hitting the books in 2029, right?
Jeff?
But I don't have a good appreciation for, yeah, that let's just say the hypothetical, you lose 20 feet. Like what is that doing from a rescue and safety perspective? How many people are we putting at risk? And again, I would default to the chief's expertise on that. I don't know if I can confidently give my opinion on that given my position, but I don't know. I think another like a 3A would be still do the 200,000, but move up the 1.9 to some other type of model. So kind of do both. It's maybe like a hybrid type of approach, given how long it takes to get some of this stuff.
So Chief, why don't you answer the 20-ish foot question?
So one of the things that we're starting to consider is we do some calculations. I think the fire department and the fire chief, when they purchased the 100-foot, did some calculations, and I appreciate what they did, and I understand them. It's basically a triangle, right? How far are you away from the building? How far the reach, and where you're trying to reach, and there'll always be buildings we can't touch, right? It just, you know, and you know, we were lucky on Sears Road later in the fire to get Hopkinton's aerial in, but again, you look around town and you look at a 100-foot, 300-foot driveway, sometimes in the house is set back off we're not going to reach. What we would do is if we start getting the sense that there was interest in this, we would kind of do a survey again and see where we're at, just to make sure. We know where some of the larger buildings we're going to give up some reach, but we also know some of those larger buildings have fire protection systems in them. Look along Route 9, a lot of them are fully sprinkled. have, enclosed exit stairwell. So we would use that in Madison Place Apartments as a good example. We would really look at the interior design to support rescue of most of the people, not the aerial. Okay. We need the reach. And I think we'd look at it. So I don't have a distinct answer now, but we would pursue that and just make sure.
Answer your question, Jeff?
Yes, and then just one other follow-up. If we were to go with the different model that you had suggested, and you mentioned it's more maneuverable, is there a likelihood that the stress on the body or the chassis would last longer because it's not as heavy, or is
I think there are options. The heavier the vehicle, the more stress. You're right. It's supposed to be, and if you design it correctly, I think I'd be more optimistic to get a little more time out of it, just because of the weight. But that's where we would want to make sure that the axles, the suspension system, the frame is built for the weight. Now that's why I think we'd have to be a little particular. We don't want to get a model that sort of works. I think the engineering is going to be very important no matter what we do in the future, engineering is going to be a big deal.
And so my last question is, can you just remind us there are certain areas of town, roads of town, I think you had mentioned this in the past, where you struggle to get up those specific roads with the current model?
Right. So take any road that has hill in it, Oak Hill, Pine Hill. I mean, those are some of our challenges. Also on Route 9, when you get on Route 9 from 85, once you start heading up towards Deerfoot, we start dogging down quite a bit. Again, I think the gearing and the motor size is a challenge. Now, that's one of the reasons why when I first got here, we moved it from a primary response unit to a secondary response, because it took us longer to get there. And then the second part is the size of it. Again, we can't make a lot of the driveways. A lot of people have the stone gates, narrow driveways. We're having a really tough time, and there's a couple roads which I think you guys can appreciate. Lover's Lane's a good one. Even Breakneck Hill, sometimes we have it's tight. The roads are tight.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Go ahead, Joe.
I know you've never been a fan of this ladder truck, and I think that comes through a little bit. Is in terms of waiting for a new school design and understanding the impact of another large building in town, is there any advantage to at least putting it off for another 2 years to figure out what we might be looking at and how that might affect the performance? And I don't understand if this is strictly just about reach and a ladder, or if there's another component that we're going to be using this for that maybe I'm not aware of, or that's not coming through in translation.
The primary deployment model for an aerial device is elevated water, a ladder that reaches high, that you can get access to roofs or balconies, because sometimes you can't. We always have ground ladders, but the max ground ladder is about 40 feet. So at about 40 feet, you're not going to use a ground ladder. So the primary function of an aerial device over a regular engine is exactly that. Second floor windows, third floor windows, holes in roofs. I think I feel comfortable with a school. I'm not worried about buying an aerial apparatus based on school size, because a school is designed as with fire protection and life safety components in it that I'm not worried about the access. If we talked about an old school, different times, but fully sprinkled, fully alarmed, exit stairwells. If it's built to the proper code, I mean, I have no issue with it.
If you shorten up the ladder, can you increase water flow? Or will a new truck have any different sorts of apparatuses on it that will allow for superior performance in some circumstances?
I think the pump size on it and the plumbing, if you will, kind of dictates the pumping capacity and the ability to deliver water. I think where we'd see the performance improvement is access. A shorter truck with a single rear axle can make more driveways, can navigate a lot more of our roads. You know, think of Flag Road. If you, for as an example, our tower truck has to go really slow. I mean, just overly cautiously slow because it's big. And it's
You're
not
telling
our,
me you might be able to increase or decrease time to destination.
correct. So
Are
that's,
there
I think
any-
that's the performance we're going to see, Joe.
Are any other towns around us using that same type of equipment?
Westboro and Hopkinton and Ashland have a larger, very similar apparatus to us. I think that's just a design of what they decided based on their occupancies and their risk. I know when I was in another department, we had one of each because we had the size, but we also, it created opportunities for us for responses just of what I said.
So we'd be dependent upon our partners for a bigger one, but we might be able to supplement them with something they don't have.
Correct.
Would that be a correct assessment as well?
Yes.
So we might be able to justify that to our partners.
Correct. And I think right now we do that. We rely on our partners to supplement apparatus that we either don't have available or we need more of. So, but again, it would support a mutual agreement and a mutual response.
Thanks, Chief.
Tony, you're up.
I think I know the answer to this, but are residential property insurance rates ever influenced by the kind of equipment that fire departments have?
Yes.
And so how do we understand that?
So
And maybe that's not a question for today.
I'll do a quick one, and if you want more on it, I can give you more. There's what's called an ISO rating for each community. It's based on your water distribution, your fire protection, your fire department. ISO ratings of the lower the number, the better your rating is. So we are in the, we had an assessment done in 2017. Working on trying to get a new assessment, but apparatus and staffing are weighted and scored. So if you don't have an aerial, you're going to score less. So you don't want to be, we don't want to do that. Plus our response, our service.
It seems like we're not really talking about should we have an aerial here. I think maybe in the future we'll be talking about which aerial is appropriate.
Right.
Okay, so thank you for answering that.
And if you want to, Tony, you can look up ISO rating for towns or communities, and we'll give you kind of a good background, and I can answer anything offline if you'd like.
Thank you.
All right. So we heard where Tony was at. Joe and Jeff, I think we heard a little bit of where Jeff was at. He had a combo approach. Joe, where are you at on this?
Is there any residual on selling the engine we have?
Yeah, I think there's some benefit. Of course, if it breaks, then there's no benefit. So that's another consideration if you do something earlier, or even by repairing it and keeping it in service. I think it has value later on.
I just meant in terms if we were going to replace it, how much can we offset the new purchase?
I'd like to say at least $100,000. if we're lucky, more. It depends on who's looking for it right now, right? I mean, it's the market.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
can't give you a
I
number. Too.
understand from that answer. Jason, I think my position is that it's worth exploring. I'd just like to see a little
What's
bit.
with exploring? Just
It's worth exploring getting a new one. Getting a
option
new
three.
three is worth exploring. I just interested in seeing what the actual numbers are, netted out. Paying $200,000 to put this, hopefully get another 5 to 7 years out, is obviously cost effective. But if we're talking about a 20-year investment and maybe lowering, operational costs moving forward, taking risk out of our system, there's an advantage to that. And certainly if it's operationally superior to get to the homes in the town, how can I not say that it's worth exploring to, go to the next step and at least flesh this out?
I guess what would help me make more of a decision is we talked about this last year. How much deterioration has there been over the last year on the body?
Jeff, I would have to go to the two vendor quotes and compare them, because I'm not sure if all the significant increase is parts and labor, or is it also there's more damage that needs to be done. So I'd have to report back to that and try to compare where it's at. We used a closer vendor this time to try to save some money, and it was still significant. So I'd have to get their opinion, what they think.
Okay, thank you.
And I've been purposely very quiet for a while. But I have some very, very few clarifying questions for you, Chief. Then I'll kind of give where I'm at on this.
Okay.
How long, if we went with the 200,000 route, would the tower be out of service for approximately?
My best guess is probably 4 months to, if it's more than we thought, it could be 5 or 6 months.
Okay. If we went with option 3 and you had a new demo ladder truck arrive tomorrow, would you operationally change how you're deploying your apparatus? Very similar to how you changed it when you came in. Would this asset allow you, without staffing increases, allow you to employ? I don't want you to go into all your strategies, but right. Allow you to employ different strategies than you can right now.
If we, I'll predicate with, if we got a different model and size, yes.
Okay.
Because it gets better access. It gives us a couple more options than we have now.
Okay. So I'm not supportive of option 1. I think it's just throwing money away to band-aid a larger cut, so to say. I would love to hear more about option 3 and reserve the right to come back to option 1 if we can't get either the chief does some more diligence with his department and finds that maybe his view differs from the people that may be working on the potential piece of apparatus. But I think we've heard, whether it's fire, police, or anything else, vehicles are difficult these days. They shouldn't be difficult, but they are. And I think we need to employ new strategies here. I don't think we capital, and I don't think the select board, I don't think advisory, I don't think the town should be dictating what operationally is required for the fire department. That's why we have a strong chief bylaw. That's why we adopted that. That's why we hire someone that's capable of doing that. Which then leads you to the finances. And the reason, right, leaving any sort of fire operational decisions off to the side for a second, the finances don't make sense for option 1. You're going to pay 200,000, so then you can go spend 1.9 million a couple years down the road. I can put together some further math, but if we gave the chief
up to, let's call it 1.3, given some of the numbers he's thrown around with the hopes he gets it to that 800. Give it that to him now. Maybe get spent in FY25, maybe get spent in FY26. Brian does his bonding thing, so maybe you don't have a real payment for even longer than that, other than some interest. You can solve an operational need. You can basically nip the inflationary pressures. And I know Joe said this already. Obviously, there's some differing views on the current tower, right? In how it should be used, but I just don't see why you would put money into an asset that we can't effectively use right now. We can use it in certain situations, is what I'm hearing. And again, leaving the strategies and the tactics to the chief and his command staff. If you looked at it purely financial, it doesn't make any sense to spend 200 to go spend 1.9. If the department was on board with an approach that maybe we don't need the 100-foot and we can achieve the same thing. And I will remind people that there still is the concept of mutual aid, right? In this aspect of, oh, if we had a 75-foot and we really needed 100, well, pre-planning deals with that, as I'm sure the chief will tell you. And if his team's going to a building that they know they're going to have reach issues, that's the research he's going to do for us in between, then they're already calling Westboro or Hopkinton or Marlboro or whoever has the 100-foot. And I think now we've got two approaches coming, and I don't agree with we should have both ever, unless something drastically changes in Southborough, right? Or some sort of optionality to, limp this other one along. So I'm a very strong supporter of, as much as I don't want to spend money now, and I don't like things popping up, and I'm also cognizant the chief's asking for a $550,000 ambulance potentially too. We need to look at this a little more, and I think the chief has some homework that I'm not hearing anyone that's resistant to further exploring this.
And Jason, just be clear, I don't think we should have both a 100-footer and a 75-footer. That was
Or
a
even
different
some
model.
combination of Mark, I know you don't have a vote at town meeting, but you are the town administrator. Do you have any strong view in this discussion?
I mean, I really don't, Jason. I mean, again, this is really all going to come down to, how we determine that we're going to finance it. And it's, we're going to vote to appropriate something that is really going, to have a limited financial impact, in the immediate future. But we're going to be voting to, the financial impact is probably, if you put your other hat on as the Neary School Building Committee Chair, the financial impact of this is not going to happen at a great time. It depending on how things roll, it could come at, at an interesting time when there's other funding things that are coming to fruition.
And I think maybe we can take that part offline, because then that's a conversation with Brian. Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, you won't be ordering another pumper in at least your career here, right?
I think
Do you
that's the plan.
What?
That's the plan.
Yeah. So right, like you have two very new pumpers in your right. One is actually fully paid off because we were aggressive with the debt there. So you only have one left on the books that I think.
Yeah, I think we're looking out at maybe 2030. I don't have it on right now because I was just afraid to put these numbers on that far out. I think we're like 2034, 2035.
11 years at least, right? So
we have, this committee, the advisory and select board been very supportive of the fire department. We recognize that. I think we've tried to always give you statistical and data to back up what we're trying to do. So I appreciate the fact that, hopefully we're getting an ambulance in February, a tanker. I'm hoping this spring that we've ordered almost 2 years ago. You know, it's all about what we can deliver and not, again, we want the support from mutual aid, but we don't want them to supplant what we're required to do. So I appreciate what this board does. But yeah, I think capital wise, we're in pretty good shape, and we're trying to be responsible of how we ask for things.
Are you clear on your homework?
I am clear on my homework.
When do you want to come back? Like how many weeks do you need?
I'll reach out to you afterwards, Jason, if you don't mind. What I'm going to do is this week, I'm going to reach out to 2 of our vendors and get some, theoreticals on, timelines. I could be surprised and find out one's building a demo that's going to be delivered in May. And then I think that once I know what we can do, I'll be working with a working group in our department, like, what does it mean operationally, so that it's not all about money, but it's also about, I think Joe hit it on it. It's how do we improve delivery of service, reasonably and predictably. And but I think if by the end of the week I could have a better idea, Jason, if you don't mind,
That's fine.
We'd probably want it no later than the first week of January to try to come back. But I know the holidays are kind of falling on weird days. I'll work with you on that.
Yeah, let's talk offline. I don't know when we're going in front of select board and advisory yet, so that will dictate it. It's January, but it's not going to be January 31st is my hunch.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else for the chief tonight? I will take working with Mark, Brian, and we'll get the inputs from the chief if needed, just to kind of schedule out what this could look like on an ambulance fund or a debt schedule. Chief will use 1.3 just to be right, and you can come back to us as you learn more.
Right.
Just because that then may sink us before we even start, but I think you've compelled us enough to think about this some more.
Well, I appreciate the questions and the thought you guys are giving into this. So thank you.
Okay. Going once, going twice for the chief. All right. Thanks, chief. Have a good night.
Be safe tonight, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, chief.
Okay. We already kind of talked about where we're at. So next week we have DPW superintendent. I expect that to probably be as long or longer than the conversation we just took. I'm not going to add any other departments to that schedule just to give Bill a chance to come in. I can tell you I've met him once. He approaches things very differently, very thorough in his process. And I think you'll find the discussion very insightful. And I think he'll be looking for some guidance from the committee on where to direct it. He brings a very different perspective, which I think will be helpful to see where we go with some of the equipment. There's equipment needs, there's road needs, there's sidewalk needs. So be no shortage of conversation. We don't have anything scheduled after next week. I would propose that we need to potentially meet at least once more before the holidays, because we need to basically digest what we've heard and start to make some decisions. There will be some loose items that we can bundle up. I would like to invite the superintendent. He's kind of on he's on the wait list, so to say, of coming in. So I told him I'd give him a few dates. So I wanted to see kind of what the 11th or 18th look like, with the full disclosure that the NERI building committee, which does comprise of Mark, myself, and the superintendent, is going to be meeting for at least a half an hour on the 18th. So the start time would be somewhat nimble. We'll have a one vote agenda on that night, hopefully. So I prefer to do the 11th, but we could do the 18th. I realize the 18th is just that much closer to the holidays. And realizing that everyone celebrates different holidays. I don't know what people's views are at this point.
Jason, if we were to do a Monday, could we possibly start at 8 o'clock instead of 7:30 like we typically do? If people would be open to that.
Not next week, but I know you already
Sorry,
have
I'm sorry,
for
I meant-
next week, right? But
Sorry, I meant
if you-
the 11th or the 18th.
and I promise we can probably keep that one to an hour or less. So does that work if we start at 8 on the 11th or the 18th?
And then we will hold you to the 1 hour agenda.
Well, I knew I headed that one off, Tony. But I think we really can if we do our due diligence and kind of, I think we all know where we're headed with some of this stuff, at least what we've heard today. Hopefully we can have some deliberation next week with DPW. I know, Jeff, you may not be able to make it, but you'll be able to watch the replay and kind of come ready to kind of where you stand based on our discussion.
Yep.
All right. Who says 11th, who says 18th, or who says I don't care?
I don't
I don't care.
All right. Let's do the 11th, just in case there's a loose end that we have to use the 18th. So the 11th at 8 p.m. with a hard stop at 9 p.m.
Perfect.
All right. I will get it calendared. Any other business for tonight? All right. 8:57 tonight, just for the record. All right. I'll make a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Roll call vote. Joe,
Aye.
Jeff,
Aye.
Tony,
Aye.
and I am I as well. I will see you all next week. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone. Bye.